operations operations chairperson, so I'd like to call the meeting to order for her. She's en route and will be here shortly. So we have quite a bit on the agenda today, and looking forward to another lively and interesting discussion. And so we'll like to get started. Again, I'm calling this meeting to order. This is the Operations Work Group meeting for Monday, August 14, 2017. First item on the agenda tonight will be public appearances, and we do have a couple of speakers tonight. First speaker will be Chris Cruzy, and the next speaker will be Katie Walsh. They are veteran speakers, so they know the rules, and I will only recite the rules to them if they need them, and I don't think they will. So Chris, you can come up and you know to push the button, and you can start when you're ready. I don't have the clock, but I'll use my watch.
Thank you. I'm Chris Carusi. I'm a district parent. I'm here to talk tonight about the proposed revisions to the district's charter school policy. First of all, I want to thank everybody here for your support of public education. I was really happy to see that the policy continues to only allow the board to consider instrumentality schools, and that's really important. So I want to point that out as a really good thing about the policy revisions. However, I have a few concerns about the proposed revisions to the policy. I want to talk about three of them. The first one is the funding formula. The proposed revisions say that the district will increase the per pupil funding for charter schools to the average amount spent by the district. The proposed revisions don't give an amount for that revision, and they don't propose a formula for calculating it. So I'm going to go with what was published in the State Journal last January, which was $12,500 per student, not having a better number to work with. If we had a charter school that had a district-wide attendance area and 200 students, and this might sound familiar, that would come to about $2.5 million in per pupil money going from neighborhood schools to the charter school. And the problem with that is the fixed costs of running our neighborhood schools won't change. You won't achieve any savings there. The fixed cost of running the Doyle building won't change. No cost savings there. And quite likely, even the schools that lose students to the charter school are going to continue to need the same staffing and supports to support the students who are left in those schools, which means we are basically going to be siphoning money out of our neighborhood schools into charter schools with no savings realized, where does that $2.5 million come from? If you look at school choice options across the state, whether it's the special needs vouchers, Milwaukee vouchers, statewide vouchers, or non-instrumentality charter schools, the highest amount is $12,000 for our special needs voucher program. Instrumentality schools, I think, get $81.88 per pupil. $12,500 per pupil would be the highest amount in the state, I believe, that would go to school choice. And even though that money would stay in our district, it would be taken out of our neighborhood schools where the vast majority of our students go, and where students who are probably the most expensive to educate are probably going to stay. So for that reason, I think you might need to raise that amount a little bit to help charter school applications be more competitive, but we absolutely should not be going over the amount we're giving to non-instrumentality schools, and we probably should be under, because the charter schools in the district are getting administrative benefits from the Doyle building and just from the district in general. Secondly, my second concern is private fundraising by charter schools. The proposed revisions take out the stipulation that if private fundraising goes above 110% of district average per pupil spending, then district support is correspondingly cut. If you allow unlimited private fundraising on top of the district average per pupil, what you're potentially creating are charter schools that are islands of privilege in neighborhood schools that are being starved of resources, and we don't want to end up in that situation. And third, I wanted to speak to the charter school application and renewal review process that is outlined in the proposed revisions. It used to be that the composition of those review committees was carefully spelled out. Now there's only one member of those committees who is specified, which is a principal, ideally from the attendance area. Otherwise, the composition of those review committees is pretty much up to the discretion of the superintendent's office, which I believe puts too much power in the superintendent's office, because the recommendations that come out of that office are likely to be adopted by the board. And so I think in the interest of checks and balances, the composition of that committee should be spelled out in the policy, the types of people we want to see sitting on those committees, even if it doesn't have to name names, but we'd like to see somebody representing X community or Y community or a certain person from the administration on there. The bottom line is am I done? Okay.
Yes.
I'll be done. Thanks.
Thank you.
First of all, I've learned so much from Chris over the last few weeks on the funding stuff. She's really dug into these numbers deeper than anybody else that I've known, so I really hope you listen. We're listening carefully to her words as well. First, thank you for listening to our community and continuing to support only instrumentalities. This is crucial because we know we can't support both strong public schools as well as a whole second education system like Milwaukee tries to do. So I'm glad we're all on the same page about that one. Second, let's be honest. This Board of Education has not followed their own charter policy that they voted unanimously for, but I'll assume best intentions this time, and the charter policy you vote on will actually be something you follow. Currently, the policy states all charter schools must have a plan to hire, retain, and recruit a highly qualified, diverse staff. This statement doesn't mean very much because we don't have a common definition for what some of these things mean. A plan, highly qualified, diverse, we don't have something common that we understand those things to be. I propose you change this language to all charter schools must have a plan to hire, retain, and recruit a licensed and certified diverse staff to include all staff, including art, music, and PE. This language defines what highly qualified means. Highly qualified means licensed and certified. It also does not assume that this only applies to classroom teachers. This language ensures that all staff at every MMSD instrumentality charter school are licensed and certified. It should not be a controversial thing to have the same standards for our instrumentality charters that we have for our MMSD public schools. Having this language does not take out the innovation that you keep talking about as the reason for these charter proposals. For example, a 20% certified and licensed art teacher in the IMA contract could be available to facilitate lessons for their 3-hour block of learning, and the lessons can be set up in the same way as the Montessori lessons. Entrees that students select into. Another part of this 20% would be consulting and working with Montessori classroom teachers to ensure smooth integration of the certified art teacher into the Montessori method. This ensures the flexibility that you desire for charters, but also ensures that we strive for the highest quality outcomes for our children. This is just one example of how we can respect what's in those charter policies while continuing to use our own certified and licensed staff. Is it equitable to provide more time and space needed for innovation within these charters than for our own teachers and our own schools? Before you allow these charters to bring innovation to our district, I encourage you to delve into the wealth that is our own teaching staff. The possibilities there are endless.
Thank you. Okay, and thanks to both of our speakers. We'll move on here, and the next item on the agenda, approval of minutes. And I'll move to approve the minutes dated June 20.
James, I'm sorry, I didn't get them ready.
Okay,
today.
all right. So we will table the approval of minutes to next time. All right, next item on the agenda then is the actual board policy 10,000 charter schools. And we'll call on the superintendent to get us started.
Thanks, James. I'd love for Dylan to join us along with Mike Berry and Kelly Ruppel. Dylan, as you know, is the scrivener on behalf of the board when it comes to board policies, but although she knows much, she isn't actually the expert on every topic, so I want to have a couple of staff members here to support her in the discussion tonight. I want to remind the board that the charter policy has been in the queue for this whole past school year. It was, we had that the policy on policies, and it was up for discussion, review, vote, and approval this past school year. We got started on that process back in the fall of last year. I think it was the October board retreat that we talked about the charter policy and specifically focused on the guiding principles. And for reasons I don't need to explain here, we haven't quite been able to continue that discussion. There have been other issues to discuss. So I just want to remind everybody about, kind of ground us in where we have been. I think it's an important policy for us for all kinds of reasons. We, as a couple of the speakers alluded to, believe that public charter schools ought to be governed by the local school board. That is just a fundamental belief of the school district. It's my belief, and I think it's shared by all of us. We want a charter policy that aligns with that set of values and beliefs. We have this past year, while we haven't been able to move forward on making revisions to the policy itself, we did create some procedure aligned to the current policy that we have. So we've got some experience under our belt this past year that I think has taught us something about what needs to be captured in this policy. Oh, was that too loud? Sorry, Dean. Oh, sorry. I didn't even notice it, actually. I was so in my own head. I was just saying that we, this past year, while we didn't make changes to the policy itself, we did have to create new procedure for the current policy that we have, and we've learned a lot from that about what works, what doesn't work, which is good because we can incorporate that into the new policy. Our senior team has had some discussions over the last year about our own beliefs about the in-district public charter schools and what role they could play. Where we continue to stand, I think, is that there is, with strategic use, there is potential to enhance our school district, but never to replace in any way, shape, or form the importance of the schools that we have that serve the vast majority of our students. But we think that there may be some use to think about that strategic use of charter school when it comes to students who have been historically underserved. And of course, I already referenced the board retreat discussion that we had in the fall where we started to talk about some guiding principles. So Dylan's going to walk you through our best thinking based on that limited amount of input that we've had to date through our experiences past year, our own senior team discussions, the board's discussion at the fall retreat. And then we're going to open it up for a larger discussion about where you want to go from here. I will say that I don't want perfection to be the enemy tonight. We have a policy that isn't serving us real well right now, and that's in part just procedurally. It's not serving us well. And I would encourage the board to at least consider making some changes in the short term while potentially continuing to have a longer term discussion about where we want to be when it comes to charters. And I say that in part because it's possible that we could get a charter proposal in the meantime while we're having longer discussions, and we'll be kind of hamstring to an older policy, the current policy that isn't working for us real well. So I'll just put that out there for you to consider. All right, go ahead, Dylan. Walk us through what you got.
And just a brief overview. So in your packets, you have the memo summarizing the changes. You have a very messy red line and a much neater accept all version of it. And that's because much of this policy ended up being a rewrite instead of a tweak. I want to also reiterate that kind of based on Jen's opening, I tried to really play the role of scrivener of this policy and capture the feedback that I've gotten both from the board in October, really going back and looking at the feedback on those guiding principles that we had, because as you'll remember, that's really where we focused on that part, that language of beliefs, values, and minimum expectations. I tried to take the feedback from SLT as to where within the district do charters fall and what purpose should they serve, which I think harmonized quite nicely with the feedback I heard from the board when we talked about guiding principles. I also tried to modify the policy in a way, because if we go back in time, when we wrote the current policy, there were still the DPI planning grants and implementation funds. So much of the policy relied heavily both on the DPI established timeline for applying for those funds, and then really accounting for those funds in those first couple of years of the school's planning and implementation, which in some cases was hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so it both drove our process and some of our thoughts around funding. So I just tried to tweak it based on the fact that those no longer exist. So we're in a different timeline and in a different financial state. I also realized that trying to build calendars out 15 years makes for a stupidly ugly policy and was very, very difficult. So in some ways, I just tried to simplify the timelines to make it a simpler policy. With respect to renewal, that's where I heard from the board that the policy was devoid of any guidance, really. It kind of said, we'll think about renewal when renewal comes up. And we learned over these last 2 years, as we had renewals and conversions from charter to magnet, that that was not serving us well. And so as an administrative team, we had tried to fill the void with process, which driving process is not a great way for things to work. And so what did we learn from what went well during those renewals and what didn't go well? And I think one of the key takeaways was how much time we're giving ourselves to have these discussions and to make these decisions. And you'll see that as a big change in both timelines. Is they're much more protracted. Having come to you as many times as I've come to you in recent months, having a protracted timeline isn't always the greatest thing, but I think it would serve us well for truly understanding proposals and changes when the renewal come. Finally, there is the financial change. And I actually offer that as one option, but not as the option. I think there are many options, and Chris laid out for you kind of that gamut of funding that is available. The reason I offered a number larger than the amount that was in our current policy is what I was talking about, the change in grant funds that were available. So that number existed when hundreds of thousands of dollars of planning grant money or implementation funds was available. That is truly an area that I think is for the board to really decide what is the funding level that you are comfortable with. So I gave that to you as one option out of many options. And lastly, I'll just touch on kind of the removal of titles from the policy, both in the review. That is in line with the trends we have been doing in most of our policies. We are transferring to the superintendent or his or her designee because of the title conflicts that we have. We went from assistant superintendents to chiefs of schools to, but it also came from a realization that we had that defined was a bit restrictive because we got presented through IMA a policy like one we hadn't seen. Our current policy kind of divides it between elementary or secondary. Well, IMA is elementary and secondary. How does that play into a really defined role? What if there is a community-based expert that has expertise in the area of innovation? Would it be beneficial to have them on the review committee? I don't know, but it would give that flexibility. And I have found in my 7 years of working with this board that we do not have a trend of rubber stamping. And in fact, when it comes to charter schools, a lot of times the administrative recommendations are actually not followed, which is a good thing. Keeps me in business. And so that hadn't been a concern when I was restructuring it, because I don't think that is our actual experience that we have had here with respect to charter schools. I have heard already some feedback on the revocation section, and that is one, in light of the conversations we've had over the last 2 weeks, that I think I will further look into. We've had some opportunities to look at some other contracts, just that it's still pretty basic as to when we could revoke the charter school, and maybe we should be looking at things like demographics and or enrollment. And so I've heard some of that feedback too, but I'm definitely open to hearing more. Thank you. So I'll open it up to you guys, I guess is what I should say.
Okay, thanks, Dylan. And we are going to open this up at this point. So I think we should structure this in the way that takes the main points that Dylan has outlined as the main changes, and structure discussion around that. So looking at the memo, the August 17th BOE memo regarding revisions, there's 7 bullet points there.
Mm-hmm.
Dylan, does that pretty much summarize what you had
Yes.
said? Okay. So the first one is with regards to policy statement. And that this was changed to focus more on meeting the needs of students that have been historically underserved by the district. So comments on that particular, the policy statement? Yeah, Nikki.
How are we defining underserved? Are we doing it demographically? Are we doing it academically? Are we doing it based on poverty level? How exactly are we defining what underserved is?
Mm-hmm. Dylan, would you like to, or Jen, Jen, you got your finger
I
on
was
the...
going to say, I think the intent was in terms of outcomes and academic achievement. But Dylan, if you want to add to that, feel
Yeah,
free.
I mean, I think that was, who are the students who perhaps our current methods are not having the most robust outcomes academically? And perhaps I became overly euphemistic in the language, but that was the gist.
Nikki, was there any particular suggestions you had?
Wasn't much suggested, as it was just wanted clarification.
Okay, yeah, good point. Yeah, TJ.
The state statutes say that we should give priorities to at-risk students, and DPI offers an extensive definition of at-risk, which I believe actually goes beyond the definition that is required for the at-risk plan, because I think the at-risk plan only starts at 5th grade, and this definition is wider. I don't know where DPI got that definition from, but they do use it, and I do think that we can, you can make a case that certainly you can make a case that advanced learners are underserved in our district. You can make a case that students who are interested in students who are musical prodigies are underserved. I mean, you can make a case for underserved under a lot of different rhetoric. So I think that if and I can imagine that we would want to have that wide definition of underserved. I personally don't, but I can imagine, so I think that we need to kind of zero in on what we are talking about and come to some kind of consensus or agreement. Are we talking about students at risk? Are we talking about students who are failing academically? Are we talking about students who are more generally underserved? And I would go with the at-risk, failing academically version would be my position.
I think we'd love to hear from other board members on that
Yeah, James.
topic.
Well, I think I've just forgotten my question. Did forget it. I think, in terms of the DPI definition, are we wedded to that? I mean, do we have leeway legally to craft our own definition in terms of the first bullet point? Are we wedded to something that DPI does?
I think we have quite a bit of leeway. I mean, yeah, I think we have leeway.
Nikki?
I would have to agree with TJ. I think that we've been talking about the at-risk for a while. Seeing that there are students who are not at risk of not graduating, they have lower grade points, and we're losing them at a large number. I think that would, and some people do not learn in a traditional educational model, and it's been shown that. So I think that we probably should prioritize.
I can see on both sides that there's benefits to the different definitions. The concern I have is that underserved can provide a lens as to how the district in our schools are meeting the needs of students. At risk is something that happens apart from whatever we're doing. The definition is more about the students than necessarily about us. And perhaps I'm interpreting it differently than other people may interpret it. But I certainly, when I think about where I might be open to a charter. I'm certainly much more open where I feel that we are not meeting the needs of that particular group of students, because there could be students who are, by some definitions, at risk or historically underserved, but we might be meeting their needs. Yeah, Anna?
Yeah, historically underserved to me does seem a bit vague. And again, I agree with what TJ's saying. I think that you would always have groups of people making the case that these students are underserved, you know, whatever gaps they might be referring to. So I guess my thought is the focus of this are we focusing on academic achievement, raising outcomes, graduation rates for students that historically haven't been successful academically in the district or graduating? And if that's what we're looking at, then perhaps we should be explicitly putting that in the charter policy. But I'm a little bit more like what I like to see charters.
I think for us as an administrative team, I mean, when the words were chosen, the intent was precisely what you said, Anna, and I think that's what we also heard at the board retreat. And I think that's where you said something about there seemed to be some what the senior team and what the board were saying in separate rooms were kind of jiving at the board retreat last fall with this focus on students who have not been successful academically, in part because they've been underserved, but it's more about the outcomes. I don't want to get hung up on the language. What's more important to me is, are we in alignment on the intent, and then we can work on the language.
James?
Yeah, I agree with Anna, and also TJ, I agree with TJ also. I think it's about timing. And what I mean is that when we look at starting a charter at this point in time, it's really about, I think, more what Anna is talking about. I think if we were talking about over the long-term years, where we try to meet the diverse needs of underserved in terms of what TJ was talking about, then we're talking about a broader group. But I don't think we're, at least not for me, that we're ever going to be at this place where we're sitting here considering tons of charters. I don't think that's really where we want to go. But I think in some very small time frame where we may have a charter, maybe two, that we want to, at least from what I'm hearing, that we really want to focus on those kids that are not being served well in the district in terms of academics. At least that's where I am, and I think that's what I'm hearing from other board members. And so again, I think TJ's version, which I agree with, is more that long-term version where you have everyone can be underserved to some degree, and I agree with that. But I think specifically is more, and I think that the policy should be specific, like Anna states, to talk specifically about those that we have not been serving well in terms of academic achievement.
Yeah, I don't want us to confuse ourselves, or anybody listening, to think that we're only going to address underserved kids by creating new charters. We do that every day in every school, so let's not confuse our conversation here, and all of our schools are attempting to do that daily. We've also created numerous alternative options to address at-risk kids already. So if a charter proposal comes to us and we're going to say it's going to only be targeting underserved students, what if someone wants to come and create a school of the arts?
That's a great question.
You know, now that's not a bad idea. Wouldn't we all like to see one? It'd be cool. We'd have probably kids, we'd have to beat them out, you know, lock the door to keep them out. So there are a lot of options that we need to consider here. So where do we do that? Our own or charters? I've always struggled ever since this whole charter thing got started years ago what do we need them for? Why can't we just create these schools ourselves? Why can't create these options through our innovative and alternative department and just offer them ourselves, and we don't have to deal with all this stuff. It gets, it's complicated. People get pissed, and it's upsetting, and we don't know how, the money gets spread out all over the place.
Ain't that the truth?
Why don't we just do them ourselves? So, if we're going to say only at-risk academic charters, that's all we're going to approve or accept. Western Wonderland wasn't that. Neither is Badger. Neither is IMA. None of the ones we got right now. Neither was Wright. They were just cool ideas that we would like to see our families have options on. So I'm struggling here.
Yeah.
What do we mean by at-risk kids? If an at-risk kid is someone who doesn't like school because all I can hear is music in his head, what are we going? What are we talking about? So I need some. If we want to do just academic, okay, that will go that way. But then the ones we got don't do that.
So I want to just a minute, and I also want to. I gotten an email from Kate about asking for her input as well. So unless Jen, you want to respond directly to Dean, I'm going to actually go to Kate and ask on this particular point with regards to the policy statement. And I do want to remind people that the next point is the guiding principles, which is actually framing around and ties into that policy statement. So I don't think we want to rework the whole policy statement without talking also about the guiding principles, which go into more detail.
I agree. I'd actually rather hear from Kate first.
Okay. Kate, do you have, would you like to add anything with regards to the policy statement? Oh, just a minute, Kate. You're not coming in very loud.
I'll give it to you. Okay, can you try again?
Yep, I'll try again.
Oh, wow. Yeah, wow.
So I would actually agree with Dean here. I think, I'm all in favor of serving our most underserved students, and I think that could look like a lot of things. I'm not sure we actually need to fully uncover that tonight with respect to guidance
leave it up.
Or the policy statement. Just because I think it actually warrants a longer conversation about what this board, how we perceive charters should work in our district, what we want them to add to the district. Is an art school something that we want to talk about? Is a 3K program something that we would want to talk about, right? There are a lot of formats that charters could take, and I think our dialogue on that would actually help our community understand where we are open and where we are absolutely not open, and probably save us all a lot of time. So I would like to have that dialogue. I'm not sure we need to have it tonight. And then Mary, I'll email you my other ones I want to comment on, so you let me know to go to me.
Okay. Well, I actually think we are talking about the policy tonight. So, Kate, I'm not sure that there's another time that's different than the policy discussion.
No, it's fair. I think I was, harkening back to Jen, how you started, which is, I think, there may be some near-term changes that we could make in a very straightforward way. And from my perspective, we're refreshing the strategic framework. This is highly related to how we think about alternatives in our district. And so there may be a longer discussion around kind of what kind of alternatives we want.
So then I believe that is an important point for the board. We have to establish the scope of what we want to be doing here, and we're never actually going to come to an agreement if we have different ideas about what the purpose of revising this policy is, and whether we in fact want to put within our next subject and what are our priorities and other discussion items for this year is to tie that specific discussion in a much broader sense that ties in at that point and that we do less big changes to this policy rather than the updates in order to make it work more or work better.
Yeah, because in terms of scope, if you don't mind my jumping in, Mary, you could focus on mainly the procedural and more technical changes on this round, which I would advise at least doing that. I think not only are we rewriting the strategic framework next year, which will give us a better big picture of what our priorities are in the future. I'm a little afraid to say this out loud, but I do think we should watch what's happening out of the UW office this year. And I think that could be informative. So I don't know what's happening with that RFP. I don't know that it affects us or not. I actually am not sure yet. But it is more information. And I always like more information when making big decisions. So there are, pros and cons to narrowing too much on the policy statement now. So I'll put that out there.
TJ.
Just confine myself, and I think I've got 5 things, and I'll try and do them very quickly. I don't think we, as a board, are ready to do the revision of the charter policy by the end of the month. I don't know what the limited one looks like, so I can't really say whether we're ready to do that or not. But I think that that a major revision, I think, should be done with more opportunity for back and forth between the board and the administration, and also the impact. I mean, the administration experiences the policy in different ways than the board does, and I think that the revision needs more than 2 meetings to do that. Secondly, to one of the things Dean said is that that Dean raised the issue of I think if we do this, in some sense, we should do this. That I don't know why we do charters, why we don't do ourselves. It's simpler. We don't have to go through those things. And Dylan also mentioned the disappearing of the planning grants. And historically, one of the reasons people have done charters is the availability of grant money, federal grant money, state grant money, and particularly private foundation grant money, all 3 of which have dried up to a great degree as far as charters go. So the reasons, and the other big reason for is to draw upon community resources and community partnerships. But but the other one, but major one was the finances, that you could get money to do charters that you couldn't get to do a magnet school. I mean, you just couldn't do it. The money wasn't there. So I want to make that point. In terms of at risk, in a casual sense, that we use the phrase at risk to describe conditions that students live in, conditions of poverty, conditions of stress, conditions of racial inequality, and we do that in a casual way. The DPI definition that they use in their charter school guidance is, I believe, all factors that are academic factors that we were talking about, with the possible exception of absenteeism might be one of the factors in there, which is kind of that kind of straddles between personal characteristics of students and school-controlled things. But so to Mary's concern about at risk being something that's outside of the control of the schools, the DPI definition is pretty much stuff that these are students who are failing academically, with, again, I said the exception around absenteeism, which I think is part of their list. I'm not 100% sure about that. I looked at it this morning and I don't completely remember. Finally, if we're on the belief statement at the top, I think that, regardless of how we define the role of charter schools in this district, and I think that there is a lot of discussion and some disagreement, and maybe someplace we can reach consensus as a board. I do think that our belief statement should reflect one of the things that the superintendent said in her introduction, which is that we consider our neighborhood schools, our attendance area schools, to be our primary responsibility, whatever you want to call it. I don't know. I don't have that next word, but something like that. And I think that belongs in our belief statement too, about charter schools. That I think the superintendent used the phrase that these don't replace. I'd be fine with that. Maybe that we can craft something better. But that's that kind of notion that that our neighborhood schools are our heart. And they are who, and the vast majority of our students will continue doing. And if we want to improve student outcomes, they are our prime tool to do it. And and that recognition, I think, belongs in our charter school policy. So I think that was all 5. Yeah, Kate.
TJ, if I could just make a quick point. I mean, I actually might even go farther, and this is maybe what I was meaning by a longer conversation, but from my perspective, the finances around charter schools are hard. And I'd like to talk more about that later, but I would be open to setting, a conceptual maximum for the number of students or the number of schools that we believe, financially the district could hold. Now that is something that will take, I think, some time and thought to work through, but might be a helpful guiding principle for us if we could come to a consensus on it.
And I agree with that, and I think we have, the guiding principles have something like that. I remembered one more thing I wanted to add, which was that Dean mentioned that our existing charter schools were not targeted at-risk students. I don't, the history of middle school 2000 and Wright is complicated, and I don't remember how that was initially targeted. But I can say that I do remember how Badger Rock and Mr. Mundo were originally targeted, and they were. And IMA, to some extent, all use this notion of addressing students who the district is currently failing to one degree or another. So that was part of the sales job. Whether it's part of the reality of those schools is something that we'll come up with in other contexts. So that's it.
So I am not any clearer after that about, and not TJ being that being a number of comments, it feels like people feel that this needs a much longer, more in-depth process that has a lot of related issues to them, and could be related to the strategic framework. It could be related to budget issues, and so it's. I think it is hard to think about that this is something that's going to happen, be voted on by the end of the month. So, and I'm not even sure where we can fit it into the calendar to have these larger discussions. So is there plan B as to maybe these timeline ones are the only changes, and that are simply changes to the timeline? I personally would have I would want to have a really thorough discussion with regards to the funding formula change, and feel that alone could take a bit of time. So, Dylan, on Nikki, I'd just like to actually hear on this particular point, and Jen, I think, and Dylan were about to respond, and then be right back to you.
Yep. So, if we could get somewhere with the timeline, I think that is important, because, like I said, it was so tied to the DPI planning grants that it just doesn't make sense for our workflow in any way. And we're too close. We've learned with IMA that even with the year out, that was kind of where we preferred. So that is section 2 of the policy. Section 3 is almost unchanged because it's the statutory timeline. The funding formula, Mary, I also agree. Like I said, that was put in there to trigger a board discussion, because that was one of the areas that I just didn't know where we had landed. I do think our current funding formula.
Hold on, Dylan, I am going to stop you, actually, because I think we're not getting into that discussion. I think we'd like to just have the discussion about whether there's a narrow group. I can say that will actually be a long discussion. I think we can be certain of that.
It would be sections 2 and 10.
Yeah.
That are the main sections that are the timeline sections.
So then to the board. Nikki, were you going to talk about what we actually address, how we proceed as a board, or was there another point you wanted to make?
Actually, I wanted to talk about also to have a timeline on revocation if the school doesn't work out. We have, when a charter may be revoked, it doesn't say if it goes back to the board, it doesn't say if it goes to the board, it just says it can be revoked for these reasons, and there are very few specifics. That's the only thing I wanted.
Oh, okay. So then with regards, James?
Yeah, in terms of where you started off, talking about the 7 bullet points and the recommended changes here, I think in terms of procedure that we should at least touch on them briefly as you were going through them. I think the only thing that I've heard here that changes the first bullet point is Dean's suggestion, which I totally agree with. And, are we, do we just simply make some change there in wording to incorporate his suggestion and move on? I'm just wondering about that. I understand the timeline and the things we want to work on here, but I'm just wondering if, because I sort of like your approach to going through these bullet points.
Well, I recommended that approach, thinking that there was a chance that this that we could cover all of this and actually get to enough resolution that would instruct the administration on how to move next. And James, I think we could be here until 9 o'clock if we really want to get people's, and I'm not going to be here. I mean, we have another agenda item here, and I just think I want to have, and I think that the board wants to have a thoughtful discussion on this. I don't see the point of going through all 7 and getting everyone's input on all of these things if we're not actually going to have that, if we're going to need a lot more discussion to get to a point where that informs policy changes.
For whatever it's worth, we predicted this would happen tonight, and not that that's a bad thing. I mean, we have 2 new members of the board who weren't even part of the discussion that we had in the fall, right? And it's okay to take some steps backward before we move forward again. And so we're comfortable with that. We do recommend that if you want to take more time, which we're fine with, that at the very least you take care of some of the timeline issues. Is there anything outside of the timeline issues that would make it difficult in the short term, you guys?
I am reflecting on the comments regarding the revoking.
Yeah.
And just wonder if we want to make sure we get that through this cycle.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to at least talk a bit about the funding formula, just because I think it's relevant for some of the choices that we're making
right now.
Yep.
Okay, so actually, Kate, why is it important right now? Because once we say with them we're going to visit the funding formula and make those changes, why not all the other ones rather than get the timeline changes done? So what is it specifically about the funding?
So with respect to our upcoming IMA votes and decisions, if, and Jen, I kind of hesitate to raise this as well, but if we were to rescind that vote and not approve IMA as a charter school and it were to go through the state process, the district would lose more money.
That's true.
From our neighborhood schools than if we were to charter it internally to the district. That math, I've done it myself. I'm sure Mike's done it as well. But I hesitate to not talk about it because I think it may drive poor decision making, or at least I think we should know walking into it, if we choose to not charter that school, that our district will lose more money and that would be pulled out from neighborhood schools if it were to be chartered. And that's an okay choice, but I think everybody should know that.
Well, my recollection from the meeting was that there's only 3 issues that are issues for negotiation in the contract, and that the financial wasn't one of those issues.
Correct. I'm not, I guess, suggesting that we engage in the IMA budget at this point, but I do think just conceptually our policy is relevant for how we make decisions about IMA, and that funding formula is part of it. So,
EJ has his hand up first.
I just very quickly that I think that it's very clear that if IMA or any other charter school went to the UW for chartering, we would lose state equalization aid. In terms of absolute revenue versus the trade-offs as the local education authority and our obligations around ELL and special ed, I don't think it's clear whether I think that there are various scenarios where the absolute cost of the school to the district could be either way, the balance on that, and I think it's actually very close. There's no question we would lose state equalization aid, relative state equalization aid. But in terms of what we total resources, I have to disagree somewhat, Kate. But that's not why I raised my hand initially. What I raised my hand initially was that number one is I don't think this is the time to have the funding discussion. Number two is I think that picking up on what Kelly said about revocation, I think that, you know, if we look at what are the pressing issues, I'm not 100% sure why the calendars are pressing issues, and I do want to hear why it is from the administration, because it doesn't appear to be one to me, and I'm open to doing the calendar stuff. I do think that the questions around monitoring, accountability, and things like, and short of revocation with existing charter schools in the renewal process, are something that we found, you know, the policy very, very lacking, and we do have one charter school that will be within the next 2 years, beginning, depending on how you look at it, beginning the renewal process. And so I think that that's a place where not just the revocation pieces, but rather how do we monitor, how do we get reporting, where do we do interventions, where do we, what is the process around that? I think our current policy is very, very lacking in those areas.
So I think TJ brings up a good point with regards to specifically why the timing issues are urgent at this point. Okay.
I do think Dylan addressed him in our opening comments. Primarily, one, the length of time has proven to be not long enough, particularly for the level of detail that this board is looking for in that final plan. I just don't think the timeline between when that initial proposal is due and the timeline between when that final proposal is due could give any proposer nor our committee the appropriate amount of time to truly analyze the plan, ask the questions, have the detailed conversations that often require data analysis to happen. It's that short period of time between the initial proposal, and the initial proposal, remember, is meant to be kind of their highest level plan. It's meant to be, should we even go forward? Do we have enough rough board support to put a full plan together? And so where you would want your time is in between the initial plan and that full plan, right? And that's where we want them spending their time, in that window. And this current timeline just isn't set up for that type of deep discussion. It's over how the holiday break, for example, between Thanksgiving and Christmas.
So I actually think the best example is our current policy says that you have until February 15th of 2018 to make a proposal for the opening in 1920.
That's right.
The new language says you have until June 1st of 2018 to make a proposal for the opening of fall of 2020. So without changing the timeline, we have a window that is still open between now and February 15th for a 1920 opening. And if we change the timeline to the new proposal, the earliest next application we have is for a 2020 opening. So it's actually tangibly just that window of time that is created by the changing dates in the red line.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan. Yeah, right. Okay, so so what I would suggest is that actually we do just focus on the timeline issues. So without getting into the funding formula, accountability,
and I will just say,
and let's get what we need to get for
revocation does say it comes back to the board, and the number one in revocation right now is the charter school violates its contract with the board. So the contract can still be the lead document in defining what is revocable conduct. So the policy doesn't constrain you. It actually says that, which is what we are seeing as we negotiate with IMA, that the contract becomes the lead document on revocation. So we wouldn't be lost if we didn't change that right now.
Okay, so I'm slightly confused, forgive me on that. So we are or we aren't going to discuss on the revocation, because I'm hearing a lot of questions on a lot of schools of, are we doing it right? With the Western Montrose, which contract are they following?
Their contract.
Their contract, that's what I wanted to know. And also, because that would that constitute the new contract because the terms have changed because we changed the terms?
We have not changed the terms of Nuestra Mundo's contract or Badger Rock's contract.
Okay, so this would constitute, because the timeline changes, this would constitute.
No, the policy, and that was actually my recommendation in it, that like technically Nuestra Mundo wouldn't hit that June 1 of 2017 date, but they already have their renewal process set forth in their contract, and we can't change the contract. But having learned from our others, that's already an extended timeline that we negotiated into the contract because we learned we can't do this in 6 months and do it well.
Right. So we still have very broad authority under the what's currently in the contract. So I think, Nikki, that was the reason of not visiting it, because we feel that it doesn't affect the current contracts.
Three things on timeline.
Okay, I actually, so, but TJ, before that.
Sure.
So I am going to say, we are going to do the timeline. And that's the only thing we're going to discuss tonight. And then the other changes will be at some future date, so that we can have the type of discussion that we feel the topic needs. So, timeline. And Dylan, we're going to TJ, and then we're going straight to the timeline issues.
I have timeline. That's
Okay,
all. That's what I
great.
want to talk
That's the
about.
only one we're
I've got
talking
four
about.
things to
Okay.
talk about on timeline to mention initially, and just that now that we're focused this narrowly, I had to go back to my list, my long list of things. Number one is I think that
You make me feel so good every
that?
time we talk, TJ. You just make me feel so good every time we talk. My long list.
I think the contract belongs in the timeline. And I think the contract. I think the contracting. Particularly if you look at the National
the
Association of
negotiation
Charter
of
School.
the
Yeah, and I think that belongs in the timeline. Number two is I think the April-May in how it relates to school board elections is difficult because you'll have approvals by new you'll have final approvals. And I guess that final approval should be phrased as authorization to negotiate contract, because that's really what it is, or instruction to negotiate contract. So I think that April-May is kind of problematic because it's new board members either meeting and people who haven't been through it. Number three is that at both the initial and the detailed proposal level, there are deadlines for draft and final versions. And I think that's a major change from our current for our current. Two pieces of that. Number one is I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that with that change, particularly at the initial proposal level, because I think as somebody characterized the initial proposal level as, is there something worth pursuing here as a general thing? And I think the investment of our time and our staff time, that either the proposal is good enough to go forward to a detailed proposal. I have mixed feelings at the detailed proposal level, but I don't think our staff time should be working with people to come to us. If you're good, you got it. If you don't, you don't. And so I think that at the initial proposal level, I would oppose the draft version. At the detailed, I'm open, but generally not real happy with it. And then related to the initial and the draft proposals is that I would like that when anything is submitted, be it a draft, be it an initial or a final one, that immediately that be a matter that be posted publicly, that the transparency is there, that the board has access to it, and not because there's a delay between when these things become public in the timeline. And I just think that if somebody's proposing a charter school, our community and our board members should see what the proposal looks like. If somebody has prepared a detailed proposal, be it draft or final, then immediately upon receipt, that should be public record. I mean, it's record that is accessible by open records requests. And I think we should, I think we should go the step forward and say that this is to be publicly posted. So those are my 4 points on the timeline.
Thanks, TJ. Dean, did you have comments on timeline?
No, pass.
Okay. Anna?
I actually like the 2-year timeline. I feel like trying to get this done in 1 year has not been successful, and I think it goes to the point where then we're put into the position of having to override our policy, which I would prefer not to do.
Okay. Kate, did you have anything on timeline?
I guess 3 quick comments. The first is I like the simplified timeline and just simplification in general quite a lot. I actually would potentially go even further just to create flexibility. I think my experience of this IMA process has been that we take the flexibility when we perceive it's necessary, so you might as well kind of just acknowledge that. And then my other...
I'm sorry, on that, could you, I'm not clear what, you said you like the simplified, but you'd go further. Is there a specific example of that? Because I want to make sure we're giving enough direction to the administration for changes, and I also want to make sure that other board members can comment or understand if you're making a specific recommendation.
Yep. So from my perspective, and I've only experienced now the last part of this process, there's maybe 3 key moments in this process in terms of chartering a school. The first would be the initial application. The second would be the vote to open the school, and the third would be the charter. And so, I might even simplify some of this process more to collapse around those key decision points, just really in the spirit of some of the flexibility that we've seen has been needed. Now, I would defer to the folks that are experiencing this more than us, which is, I think, probably Dylan and Kelly, you guys. So, if the more directive is useful, then great, keep it. But if not, I want to be able to actually hold to these timelines. So that's what I meant by flexibility. The other 2 comments were, so you heard my third kind of key moment was around the contract, and that's not on here, so I would also add that. And then similar to TJ, actually, just the election timeline is a little tricky with this process, but again, it's not kind of a sticking point for me. It's more of just wanted to raise it. I'm sure there's good reasons for when this starts and stops. So.
Commenting on the flexibility issue.
Yeah. So.
Or actually, not so much flexibility, but I'd say it's simplification. Do we need to have the amount of detail that's there?
The way it's structured right now is really the only thing set in stone is that we have to have the timeline on our website annually, that it has to allow for a 2-year cycle for the charter, and then what's included in there is meant to be an example, so that we don't lose what we were thinking to kind of institutional drift. So the timeline in there is an example timeline, so I think that the flexibility is already built into the policy, because 17-18 it may look like this, but 18-19 it may look different. I think to TJ's point, the example might be built around the election cycle a bit better, right, with that crossover meetings and those kind of things, which would then also help us. But I personally think the flexibility is already in there, but Kate, if you disagree, I'm certainly open to that.
No, that makes perfect sense. I think that was certainly lost on me, so I didn't understand that. Great, sounds great.
Okay, so Dean, yeah.
Dylan, our hesitation, at least mine, is not due to the lack of your work. It's the deepening of the questions that I've got since over the last several months in our discussion around the current, this coming in the midst of it has just made me think deeper and more hard on it.
I appreciate
So
that.
it's, you did a good job to get it to here, so don't
Thank
think
you.
we're saying, anything like that. So just
Thank you,
wanted to
Dean.
mention that.
Okay, so unless there's additional comments from the board members, I'd like to just go through.
One more.
No, just Okay, what?
It's that I think that the timeline puts things before the operations work group, and that the interaction between budget work and the operations work group, particularly in the spring, is something that perhaps that this should go to, should be designated to a special meeting or something along those lines rather than operations work group. And that kind of, so that's.
Okay, that's not sure that's timeline. I think that might be something else. But the 4 points about the previous points that TJ made, I just want to get other board members' input on whether those are changes we want, that there's other support for that. So the first one is that contracting belongs in the timeline. Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Oh.
Why wouldn't it be?
It's not currently, right? So this would be, so, okay, I haven't heard any nays, and I'm seeing some nods, so, sounds positive.
Yeah, I mean, that's, doable.
Okay, that we heard from Kate also, that the timeline takes into account a possible new board members, so with school board elections.
Yep,
Okay.
and I'll look at those examples.
Nods on that one, nays, okay. And then the proposal, whether the initial proposal has both a draft and then also a final, right, TJ? That was the main, you said on the final you could go both ways, but on the initial, I'm sort of with you on the initial proposal, whether we need to have a draft and then a final. And maybe,
What's
James.
the difference between initial and draft?
Well, I think that's what,
It seems the same to me.
Well, I think the initial proposal is the stage, and I think that to go from an initial proposal draft to a final would require more of our staff time.
No, I understand, but my point is that it seems to me that there's only two. You have the initial one, and that's, which is the draft, and then you go through staff time and everything else, and then you have the final. So
no, are you saying, though, I understand, I think I'm understanding it differently, that there's two different versions of the proposal that's not actually the,
right.
it's just the one where we say go ahead with it to the next step, right? But there's two times that we review it.
Yeah, essentially, if it didn't meet expectations, there was a chance to fix that, to be re-reviewed, to be forwarded on, right? So the initial draft, we're looking through it using a rubric earlier than the latest date established, right?
Yeah.
To say, hey, if this were what you turned in today, this is what you would be graded on, and this is how it would be graded. Take this feedback, leave this feedback, but once it is your final draft, that's what's going to be graded, but that's kind of how it plays out, is as a mile marker using the rubric. So not.
I actually think that's beneficial, and we should give them that opportunity. Dean?
Yeah, from what I recall in the contract, that initial proposal was given 8 hours of staff time, and then the second one was given 12 hours of staff time for you. So is that what you are, TJ? Is that where you're saying?
Well, some of it is staff time.
It has to be graded at some point with some staff time so it can be brought here and say, hey, go forward or not, and then.
Some of it is staff time. I think that at that initial proposal level, I think that the board considerations are: is there something worth digging deeper here? And I think that if somebody turns something in and it doesn't pass that pretty low bar, to me, then we shouldn't be spending the time with it. And I think that's a low bar. Now, when you get to the detailed proposal, we're at a question of, it's past that low bar. It said there's something worth digging in here, and then an opportunity to hone it and bring it to something that goes beyond worth digging deeper to to actually doing, I can see going from draft to final there. But on the first one, I just don't. I think that, and I think we also learn more about people if they submit something and, they've got a copy of our rubric, they've got all this stuff, and it doesn't meet it, then we know something about these people that I think is worth knowing. So that's my opinion on it.
I'd like, Mary, for Kelly to be able to shed a little light since she's been so intimately involved.
Yeah, and it's really only because I've, lived that particular stage. I do think even in the initial process, it's really important that we can be speaking the same language. And then a lot of times, right, if someone has a vision in their head, it doesn't always come across on paper. And they might be able to, like, explain it, and when we look at it through a very district lens, right? Our way of thinking, our acronyms, our processes, procedures, formulas. And someone coming from the outside, regardless of who it is, doesn't always speak our language or understand that level of what we might be looking for. And what I felt that stage was most helpful for was opening up that conversation. Because when you see it kind of on writing, you say, well, we interpret that as this. Is that what you meant? If not, rewrite it so that it is kind of the way that the district eyes would see it. And that's the part of the conversation that I think is actually extremely valuable. If at the end of the day we want to get to the best plan possible for our kids, I don't think you can wait until the nth hour of us reviewing that draft and 8 months into the process. That I would want as a committee that level of draft review, sending it back and if they decide not to change it, that's fine, that's their choice. But I think that step is an important one. And the reason why I'd like it built in is so that it's consistent for everyone, and there's not just some proposals getting that chance instead of others.
Anna, did you have something?
Yeah, well, my comment was just, and I think going through this process with IMA is, I like the extended timeline because I think that puts the charter school folks, gives them time to create a good plan and a proposal. I guess my concern on the school end side, though, is that I do get concerned when we have the proposals, the drafts, the contract coming back time and time again, because I think that does take a lot of staff time on our part, which is, we don't factor that into the expenses. So I don't know where it would be, but I guess I would like to think we could come up and say, this is going to get you're going to get 3 tries to do this at a certain point, and then we don't and then that's it. Because that's a big investment of our time. I don't know how that would be in there, but I just do feel putting some limits on how much we're going to go back and revisit a proposal, revisit a contract. I just think, because we could be doing this for years.
Nikki?
I was thinking something very similar to Anna. I think we have to give them time. What little I know in contract law, and I see this as a contract, is that you have to give, under state law, the right to cure, which is the right to fix any problems in any contract, and this is a contract. So I don't think we have a choice on that small portion. But by limiting it, say, you get 3 tries, and that's it, then you have had ample time to cure it. If you can't cure the defect, if you can't fix it by that point, then you should pull it.
Okay, and so we have different things between the contract and actually the proposal too. But what I'm hearing is, Kelly, that you feel that this is being able to give that feedback, having them be able to revise their proposal, but also hearing Anna's point. I think she said it very eloquently about, where do we draw the line as to how many times we go through revisions.
Yeah, and that's where the 8 hours
That's what I was gonna say.
comes in. And to be clear, this last time through, there was only one opportunity.
Yeah.
The contract was
Okay.
different, but the initial proposal had one opportunity to cure.
Yep. Okay. I think then that TJ?
I just want to pick up on what Anna said about the times, is that our current policy, as I read it, only has one opportunity for a detailed proposal, yet there were 2 detailed proposals done. And so what kind of language can we include in this new policy that says that if you have a draft and you have a final, then you don't have a third in there, because our current policy very clearly says one detailed proposal that is submitted by this date. Yet the detailed proposal we considered in January was submitted 21 days after that date, because there was a draft and process. In clear violation, I mean, I just have to say, in clear violation of our policy. And so how do we stop that from happening here?
You don't write that down, you resolve to follow the policy, which we didn't resolve to last time.
Well,
That's
you
how-
know,
that's how you
our policy also tells us to consider the detailed proposal when we vote on the contract, and I don't know which detailed proposal I'm supposed to consider, the one that was submitted on November 1st or the one that was submitted on November 21st, because the one submitted on November 1st is clearly a conversion from a private school. The one on the 21st is not. Different rules apply. 2M applies to conversions from private schools. So which detailed proposal am I supposed to be considering? I mean, I'm, you know, I don't know.
Okay, so, Dylan, or James, did you have a point?
No, I did not.
Okay, so we're back to just how, whether, it sounds to me that we're fine with the initial proposal being able to get feedback, and that there then be 2 steps in that. And that if the administration sees additional opportunities in order to be clear about the number of revisions or the amount of time, that it feels like there's certainly board support for that. Nikki?
I don't mean to be beating a dead horse, and please don't get mad at me, but I have one question. TJ brings up an interesting point on which one we're supposed to follow and which proposal we're supposed to follow, because if 2M applies, then we didn't give 30 days notice. If 2M doesn't apply, then...
It's a different
Yeah, it's a
meeting.
different,
meeting.
yeah.
Got it. Or wanted to, sorry, as I said, wasn't...
No problem.
Still getting used to the hang of that.
Okay, so I think that was point number 3, and point number 4 that TJ brought up was whether initial or drafts that part of the policy is that they are posted publicly. Is there any, no thanks, board members, lots of nods,
More people see it, the
no
better
names?
feedback they get.
Okay,
Yeah,
well, that's,
we've posted
TJ,
it
that's,
public.
we can say
Mary,
the 4
We had a
points.
four.
Could I
That's good.
just address real quick the reason
Sure.
for, because I think TJ's was 2-part. One, that we post it, we all agree. But the 2 is the time question. And the reason why there is some delay is these, especially the larger plan, is a very substantial document. And our hope was that our own team would have a chance to review it, understand it, and analyze it before the public does, and we get a lot of questions that we can't answer. So I would respectfully ask the board for some sort of timeline in order for us to actually do our work and prepare for you and prepare for the public.
James?
So do you have a suggestion as to what that timeline would be?
I believe it took us 2 weeks this last time.
Well,
I don't recall, TJ. I don't have the dates in
No,
front of me.
I just want to say that I appreciate that you would like to be able to respond, but I think that, you know, giving that saying that we will be responding with an analysis in 2 weeks is a perfectly valid response. And I think that giving the public the chance, again, these are documents that are available through open records request. That's the second it walks in the door, or whatever. So. And, you know, and in fact, with the IMA proposal, I had to do an open records request to get a copy. I asked for a copy, and as a board member was refused. And I find that incredibly offensive. Don't roll your eyes, Kelly, I'm sorry. You did refuse my request.
Okay,
so,
just staying
you know.
on topic here. So I think that I'd like to hear from other board members about the 2 weeks, whether the staff has 2 weeks in order to review the proposal to be able to respond to questions before it's publicly posted.
I would support that. I mean, I think we all benefit as a district when we are thoughtful in our kind of external communications, and so just, you know, charters are big newspaper items, right? And so I would want to have as professional and thoughtful response as possible.
Nikki?
Sorry, Kate, I did not mean to cut you off. I'm not used to someone on the phone, so I apologize on that. My issue is we are about transparency as a board. We're about transparency as a district. Therefore, I think if we're going to make this public, we need to get it to the public as absolutely soon as possible so they can weigh it. It only helps our decision for the public to know about what the proposal is as much as it does anyone else.
Well, I think that in my personal opinion, I'm not saying this as chair of the meeting, but I believe that what we want to make sure is that the public has adequate time to be able to review, but also, and I don't think we're standing in the way of this. We're talking about processes this is a 2-year process, and for our staff to be able to be prepared to field questions, whether they come from the public or they come from the press, I think that we do all benefit from having clarity. They're large proposals, and as a board member, I also want to be able to have those insights when responding to questions. So I favor having 2 weeks. I don't think is a huge amount of time, and as long as we give the public, make sure that yes, transparency, but I also think that our staff having adequate time to just review, I think, is important. James, and then back to you, Nikki.
Sometimes I think we really get distracted. I mean, transparency and all of these words we use. We're talking about 104 weeks, and the district is asking for 2. Yeah. I don't know how that's not being transparent. I don't use all those words. I mean, I think we sort of start to mislead here, and so we're saying the public will have, out of 104 weeks, we'll have 102 of those weeks of information, and the district is only asking for 2 of them out of 104. I think it makes a lot of sense to support the district on this one.
Sorry, I'm wordy. It's a law school problem that I've never quite managed to overcome yet. But my issue and what I wanted to clarify is this. Sometimes we get the change of the contract, and the public gets a change of the contract on a Friday for a vote that's less than a week away. That's what I'm worried about. That's what I want to change.
So, Nikki, we're not actually talking about the contract, right? I mean, we're talking about
initial proposals.
This is initial proposals that can run how many? I mean,
many pages.
Right. This is the initial proposal, so it's not a contract, and we are talking about. What is the timeline between the initial proposal and when it comes to the board for input, or?
We basically had November and December, and that's for the full plan, between the initial to the full plan.
September,
and then the board
November.
had it in January for public hearing.
So if it was posted 2 weeks after being received, how much time would the public have before the board is taking?
Over a month. Over a month.
Right. So Nikki, to your point, are you giving people is
okay? I wanted to make sure it was over about that the document would the proposal. Then that's a lot better. And I understand the board's need, and I understand the staff's need. Oh my God, they work their butts off, and they should be. I just want to set a policy where we are as open as possible.
Well, yeah, and I'm glad that TJ brought up the issue. I think this is a compromise that makes sure that information is that we are transparent. I think we are all in support of that, but we also are able to have the staff be prepared to answer questions for both the board and the public on that. Dean?
Something firm, though, within 2 weeks. Yeah. If this one took you 2 weeks, if you're not done in 2 weeks, publish it anyway. You'll be done pretty soon, shortly. But within 2 weeks, as soon as you get a chance at your first crack, then get it out there as soon as you can, and that makes, that's reasonable. You don't have to wait till the 14 days if you got it done in 10 or even 1 day.
TJ?
Just for some clarity, the timeline as it is here talks about when the the language gets very confusing, but the final initial and the final detailed proposals are before the board and released, and the analyses related to them. The timeline doesn't have anything about the drafts on the initial and the draft initial and the draft detailed. So I guess that would this 2 weeks being discussed cover those, or would it only cover the finals?
So right now, the example timeline, which is
Yeah,
yeah. For the initial proposal, it has a draft due September 18th of 2018 and a final due November 6th of 2018.
Right.
So I think that 2-week window would mean around October 1st.
That's right.
The draft initial.
I just wasn't sure whether the discussion covered the drafts or the finals, and that's what I was asking. So the 2 weeks on the drafts and the 2 weeks on the finals.
Yes.
That's a compromise I can live with.
Okay, great. Excellent. Love that when we can do
Mary, I
that.
do need to say on Kelly's behalf, I want to remind the board that we don't have someone full-time committed to approving and managing charter relationships, right? This is one duty on a pile of many. And as we stated in the beginning of this meeting, and TJ repeated later, we are serving 50 schools. Right, so to drop everything, to immediately review a charter proposal and be prepared to post it and take on questions would be asking an awful lot. So I appreciate you allowing Kelly and all of our staff members to keep our eyes on our daily work. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we got all the issues with regards to timeline. Dylan, you feel you have clear direction for?
My only hanging question is, do we want, so the other amended timeline was the timeline for the renewal. Which right now we don't have any pending renewal, so I think we can live with it as is, but I just wanted to clarify that I would not be changing that section based on the current.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm good.
Excellent.
Thank you,
So, that was the last item. And so, is there a motion to adjourn?
So second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We're adjourned.
Okay, the question now is, do anyone need a minute before we continue?
I could use to stretch a minute,
All
but
right.
just like 5 max.
Okay,
5 max.
let's try to keep it at 5, please.
special Board of Education meeting in open sessions, a workshop for Monday, August 14, 2017. So I am calling this meeting to order. And this particular meeting will focus on the board it's a board organizational meeting. So we'll be looking at our board calendar and a series of scheduled events for the upcoming year. And to kick us off, I'd like to call on the superintendent.
Thank you, James. Yeah, this is our annual organizational meeting, which we've been doing for a few years now, and it's been really helpful every year for us to get your input and feedback so that we make sure that we're tackling the topics that are worthy of the board's time. In this little segment, I wanted to do a quick review of the purpose of each type of board meeting. And I'll spend very little time on that, just to keep us grounded. I want to propose some ideas for possible areas of focus for the board next year. And Anna and James, as board officers, have already seen these potential focus areas and kind of gave their go-ahead to bring these ideas to the board as a whole. The concept here is really, again, getting back to how do we use our time better as a team to have the most positive impact on students and student outcomes at the end of any given year. So we want to talk about, pretty much like what does the board want to accomplish this coming year? And if these are things we want to accomplish, that then tells us how we should be spending our time together. And then lastly, with those areas of potential focus in mind, I'll go through some best thinking on possible board topics and get your feedback. So if it's all right with you guys, I'll dive right in. Sound good? Okay. So just a quick reminder, and you may want to reference the more detailed document that's in your board packet for tonight. Mm-hmm. You should have that out and in front of you. Just as a reminder, we have a whole bunch of different kinds of board meetings in any given month. We have, I'm actually going to start with special meetings. I'm going to use this grid and go from left to right. On occasion, we have special meetings, and those are topics that don't fit squarely into a particular work group, such as the board organizational meeting that we're having tonight. We have a monthly regular board meeting, and that is really the place where the board votes, where you take action. And I always have a segment, as you know, in every board meeting where I give you some highlights on what's happening in the district, specifically related to progress on our strategic framework and related outcomes. The two work groups, instruction and operations, are both places where we preview policy items that the board will vote on at the regular board meeting. And they're both places where we discuss district strategy. In instruction work group, those are strategy discussions related to instructional items, and the operations work group, strategy items related to operational items. And then, of course, we have the board retreats. 3 board retreats a year at this point, one in the fall to kick off the school year and make sure we're all clear on our direction. One in the middle to do kind of a mid school year check-in in February, and then one at the tail end of the school year to talk about what we accomplished, what we think about that, and where we want to go next.
Maybe we should label these tri-yearly.
Yeah, they're not really quarterly, are they? They're, yeah, we probably should change that, huh? We used to actually have 4, just as a reminder, and we just have never really changed the title. So, let's do that. We're educators, so I think we should actually use the language that is the most appropriate. Triannual retreats, no longer quarterly. So those are the items, and just on the board retreat item, reminder that at those meetings we not only talk about our strategic framework and a big picture, there is a session enclosed where I get feedback on my performance as the superintendent, and there's generally a segment that is for the board to discuss their own functioning and how you're doing as a board. So that is what the board retreat is all about. Any questions just about this before we move into the detail of next year? Nikki?
On the special meetings, I know you don't have to have a public comment period, but anyone object to adding one just so that we are as informed as possible, or would that be too problematic?
Well, that is by board policy a decision that the board president makes when it comes to special meetings. So it is always there as an option. But in terms of at least this process, it's we don't say whether or not you should or shouldn't. Yeah, that's right. There's nothing that
Just wanted to
prevents
make
you
sure.
from doing it. That is right,
You're not
Nikki.
doing a good job, James. I just didn't know.
Yep. There's nothing that prevents you from doing it. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, so that's the scope of the type of meetings we have and why we have them. So let's talk about possible focus areas. And I took some liberties and wrote this up based on what I heard at the end of your board retreat in June. And the three things that seemed to rise to the surface in our board discussion were these. That the board was very interested in spending its limited time this upcoming year focused on the rewrite and update of the strategic framework. In our meeting in June, we talked a lot about wanting to anchor the framework to this idea of student engagement and belonging, especially students of color. So I put that there as a reminder. The most important thing is that the strategic framework rewrite is coming up, and it is the board's, I think it's an obligation of the board to be really engaged in that process, and I think you feel the same. The second bullet is about HR strategy. One of the areas of great interest that came up in June was about not just the technical aspects of what we do in HR, but more strategic than that. What is our vision? How do we make sure that we're recruiting, placing, retaining the best and the brightest in our district who are going to serve our students well? So I put that here. And I know in the June discussion, part of that discussion was very focused on employees of color, but certainly not entirely. And then the third area of focus that I heard, and that has a lot to do with the outcomes, that our student achievement outcomes as a district was on secondary programs and strategy. We all want better for our students. We're struggling with how to support students, particularly in middle school. And so I felt like this was an area that, again, would be an important focus for the board in the year ahead, and certainly would support me in leading the district. So I'll just let that lie there for a minute. I want to come back to these three ideas, but I want to show you how they play out in the possible topic areas that the board would discuss in the upcoming year. So if you'll go to that document, there's a picture of it, you'll want to have that in front of you. I want to walk you through some best thinking here. And there are some changes, so I'm going to highlight those changes from past practice, all with an eye on focusing your time and energy on the decisions that are most important to our district right now. So I'm going to start from the left and go to the right. On special meetings, there's actually no new news here. These are the only things that are listed are the things that we have to do, or the things that we generally do on an annual basis. So you see those listed there. Yeah, and I'll take clarifying questions along the way before we open it up for discussion. TJ.
Traditionally, we've done BEP stuff through the special meetings, and I see BEP is under instructional work group. So I guess that is a change.
I'm going to get there.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Correct. So there shouldn't be anything surprising there. Any quick clarifying questions just on the special meetings column?
What's the board policy cleanup item?
I think you're jumping over, is my guess.
That's
Yeah, I think
Under
you're maybe
note of
looking
field.
at.
Yeah, I looked at the wrong
Do
column.
you need a different document in front of you? Can somebody help Nikki get what she needs to be looking
I
at?
looked at the wrong one.
Yeah, there you go. Nope. We're going to make sure we're all on the
I
same
was looking
page.
at the wrong week.
Yeah, look at the second page.
Yeah.
There you go. First
Yeah,
column,
the other one was way too tiny.
the special meetings column, which is, mine isn't colored,
White.
it's just white. Okay.
Got it.
So let's move to the regular board meeting column. There are always some things that we have to vote on. Those are listed there, budget, audit report. As far as superintendent updates, what I would like to do next year is focus my updates on the strategic framework, essentially. Our annual and mid-year report. I want to provide some updates on the accelerated strategies that we built into the budget this year. Community schools, since we just finished our first year of community schools, I want to give you guys an update on how that's going. This year's focus on culturally responsive teaching, I want to let you know how that's going. I'd love to bring some students to talk with you, as well as some teachers. And then a request that came out of a board officers meeting was that I provide an update and an opportunity for discussion with the board at every single board meeting this year on the strategic framework planning process, just how that's going. And we'll come back to that more in a minute. But that's what we're thinking in terms of the superintendent presentation. I do want to draw out what is missing from this list that I typically talk to you about. One thing that I took out, and I'd love your feedback on this, is the annual enrollment report discussion. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later because I'd like to give you that information in a different way than I usually do. The enrollment report, in my opinion, hasn't changed significantly from year to year. So I personally don't feel like it's been the greatest use of our limited time in a regular board meeting to have the discussion, and mainly for that reason. I'd rather give you other updates. So, and much more aligned to our work on improving student achievement and outcomes. So, any questions on that before I go to instruction work group? Clarifying questions? Okay, instruction work group. We have 2 items that the board will be required to vote on up at the top, the advanced learner update and plan revisions, as well as summer school. So those are on the instruction work group list. The next chunk are strategy updates, mainly focused on this area of middle school and high school, secondary programs. So you'll see the middle school model, middle school start time, pathways, alternatives. I added in a bullet that says at risk here, and I want to explain that a little bit. You all know that we have an at-risk plan that we will be implementing for the first year. Ricardo Hara, who is right behind me, who I hope some of you met during the mixer earlier, is likely going to be taking on a special project related to at-risk. And I wanted to put a placeholder here because I think it might be important for Ricardo to give you some updates on his work as it relates to the most at-risk and marginalized students at the secondary level, and his work to help us learn how to address their needs better.
We
Go
have
ahead, TJ.
a renewal or something of the at risk on the August
We do.
main board agenda, and this is separate from that.
It is.
Okay.
It is separate from that.
Just checking.
Yep, it is separate from that. The last bullet on that list says special education and student services staffing instructional design. In the instruction work group, we were also hoping that we would have a chance to talk with you about our efforts to improve the allocation process in service of stronger instructional design and service delivery for students with disabilities, but not necessarily limited to students with disabilities. We were thinking about the behavior education plan staffing discussion that we just had with David Osher a week ago. We think that falls under the larger student services allocation concept. So just know that that's why that's there. Yeah, go ahead.
Would ELL staffing be included in that? Because that's moved around.
No, it would
Okay.
not. So, yeah,
Could
we
we?
can give you that feedback in a minute, TJ, yeah. At this point, no, and this bullet is related to the budget item on special ed allocation, which you may remember we're wanting to get some potential outside help in doing that. It's also outlined in the special ed plan itself that we're going to do this particular work. So, so just know that it ties to a couple of places where we've made a commitment. Okay. Last thing on the instruction work group list are a couple of policy updates, and this is new. Typically, policies have always gone through the operations work group. And in discussing time management, kind of balance between the operations and instruction work group meetings, our thinking is that it would make more sense in the future for big policy discussions, for anything that's instructionally kind of oriented, to have those big policy discussions in the instruction work group, anything that's more operational in nature in the operations work group. And these are for the kind of the bigger, heftier policy discussions. So here you see the BEP policy, which is an annual discussion that we have as a team, as well as the class size policy, which came out of the discussions we had through the budget process this past spring. And we discussed as a team that it would be important to revisit the class size policy. So that's why why that's there. Any questions about what's in the instruction work group column? Just, again, clarifying questions for now. Make sense? Okay. It's still hefty, you know, without a doubt. But I'm going to show you what's been taken out in a second. On operations work group, of course, we're going to be talking about budget a lot. So budget is at the top of the list, but you'll see some sub-bullets there. And what we've put are that the budget discussion would happen with early guidance on a few key issues. So before we get to kind of the kickoff of the budget process itself, we would have already taken care of some business. We want to already have talked about class size so that by the time we get to budget, we're not having the policy debate within the budget process, but we will have figured that out beforehand. We are also hoping that we would have already talked about compensation through the larger HR strategy discussion so that that can naturally flow into the budget process. So we're not having to necessarily work that out there. It will have been already discussed in advance. You'll see a sub-bullet on facilities, and that's specifically related to the long-range facilities plan discussion we had recently, where we might want to prioritize some projects. Again, we'd like to have that discussion before we get to the budget process. And then you'll see a sub-bullet on staffing that gets back to the special ed and student services bullet. So in parens, I put C class size policy, CHR, C LFRP, LRFP. I hope you're getting that those are all tying back to other topics that are somewhere else in the board calendar. So that's what we're thinking. I say all of that because last year we started the budget development process much earlier than usual. We tried something out. We started in, well, we definitely started by November, but I think we actually started at least a little bit in October. And and we aren't totally sure that that served us well in the end. And we think that it might be better to actually keep the budget development process kind of back where it used to be, more of a December start date. This is more getting into months, but I just want to demonstrate this point. But that process will go more smoothly if we've already taken care of some of the work in advance. So I'll just put that out there for your consideration. On partnership agreements, we're going to we've got a few coming through the operations work group, Forward Madison, People, Youth Apprenticeship. We've got to tackle those things, and we may have a new partnership coming through. So I just wanted to flag that. Under facilities, we're going to need to talk about long-range facility plan, building off of the presentation that Mike and the team just gave you this summer. On HR, we definitely want to dive into the HR vision with a focus on compensation strategy, but not limited to that. That would be inclusive of giving you your annual HR report linked to the affirmative action plan that we have not yet approved, because we do think those things go hand in hand, and the employee handbook. We think all those things are actually bundled together, and if we do this well, the HR strategy discussion will help us make some other key decisions. And then last but not least, on the bottom of that list are the policy updates. And this might be what you were referencing earlier, Nikki. Mm-hmm. We have a heavy policy list this year. And we don't think it would be a great use of the board's time to go through 50 policy documents. What we are proposing to you is that we actually create a subcommittee of the board that would work with Dylan. So 2 board members working with Dylan. We have a couple of you in mind so that you may know who you are. But we think it would be nice for Dylan to have some feedback outside of the full board meeting to work through those policy documents. So by the time they get here, the board can feel confident that they've been vetted and not have to spend so much time on some of the smaller policy items. The big ones we would bring to, the full board, that policy, class size, as an example. But you get the idea. So I look forward to your feedback on that. I do want to flip back to something real quick. On the last page, there is a list of what would not be on the annual board agenda that usually is. So while we have a hefty agenda, we're actually taking some things off that you have typically discussed on an annual basis. But what our proposal is that we would give these updates to you in writing. They would be publicly posted. Any board member who wanted to learn more or discuss it could certainly talk to us about it, and we would do so. But because there aren't necessarily kind of big decisions that have to be made this year on any of these items, we feel comfortable giving it to you in writing instead. Yeah. So there's that. Okay, now I promise I'm almost ready to be quiet. On board retreats, which you'll see in the final column, because of the rewrite of the strategic framework this year, our proposal is to use the board retreats a little bit differently. Typically, we use the board retreats to monitor how we're doing on the strategic framework. We think we should use all that time for the board to work on the rewrite of the strategic framework. We can actually come back to that a little bit later. Let's say that to the end. But I know Dean has a couple questions on it, and some others may have as well. I think the board retreats would be anchors of the strategic framework process, but not the only place where the board is involved. So the board would have that full first retreat to help me and us define what our kind of big ideas are that we think we want to build into the next strategic framework. I would use those ideas to kind of to vet them with the community that we serve in the first semester of the school year. Board members would be invited to attend any of those meetings that they want. And board officers, we talked about creating some sort of Google sign up so that board members who want to go to a community meeting with me or a parent meeting or a teacher meeting or whatever you'd like could be a part of the listening. We would then have a midpoint in February where we could talk about what we learned in that first semester, further define where we think we need to go through the next strategic framework in terms of priority areas. That would then flow into like a strategic planning series of meetings so that by the end of the year we will have rewritten the strategic framework. So that's it in a nutshell right now, but just know that the board retreats are serving as anchors and not the only places where the board is engaged. in the strategic framework rewrite. So I'll stop there and open it up for any feedback. Very specifically, I'm hoping to find out if these are the right focus areas, those 3. And then is there anything that you think is missing, needs to be changed, that you disagree with? And I'll go ahead and pass it back to James.
Okay. So we have focus areas and things that you agree and disagree with. So, Dean, you had your hand up.
Yeah, there's one area that the board never gets hardly any presentations on, and that's MSCR. It's a huge budget item, and we've never had that ahead of it. There's just been a change in leadership, a long time director's gone, and the new one there a month and a half. I think the board needs to see a report from them at least once a year, and particularly now, since I've been on the board, we've never, I think once, and I don't remember what it was about. And it's what do we spend on it? 14 million? How much is MSCR?
About 18.
You know, something like that. It's a lot of money, and I play on a softball team. My kid went to a lot of stuff. That's the extent of what I know about MSCR. I'm on the board. So, and we bought a cool building on Cottage Grove that I haven't been to yet.
Right.
You know, so I think we got a special meeting or somewhere. I don't know if that's probably operations, but we need to have that. Yeah, or something like that.
Nick? I'm sorry. Were you
I'm done.
I was thinking that I know we discussed behavior education plan, but possibly a specific special meeting on suspensions and expulsions. I know where the suspensions rose, especially in middle school on the third quarter, and I think we need to tackle that.
Yeah. So say more, Nikki, because right now where we have the behavior education plan built in is a mid-year discussion and then the end-of-year annual policy discussion.
I like that. It's just the whole behavior education plan is a ginormous document.
Yeah.
It just is. And to focus on, Dr. Osher stated that race is still playing a role, that disparity is still playing a role. I think we need to get ahead of it.
Yeah.
I think that it's something we need to do, not just in the summer, but before school starts. How are we going to prevent this from being an issue? How do we keep this from doing that? Do we need a specific behavior rubric that helps our teachers to explain how they do it? Because the number one thing I'm hearing from a lot of teachers is, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I really think that would be helpful.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
TJ?
I'll try and be as organized and brief as possible. I think front-loading class size and compensation and those allocations in the budget process is a good idea. I think maybe either in November or December, I think that having a calendar for the budget and having the board give feedback and perhaps approve a calendar might, especially with the changes around this. So I think that's good. Want to note that the partnership agreements have initially mostly were the instruction work group. Then last year, some of them drifted over to operations, and this year they're all over to operations. And I guess that's a change, and we have experienced kind of historically, and that the operations ones tend to be packed.
Yeah.
So that's a place
So we
where
could balance out a little bit.
we can do that.
Yeah.
Where we can do something. I think that Chapter 8000 is perhaps part of the HR vision compensation, HR report, and affirmative action employee handbook. And when I see all those four things together, I think that perhaps a 6 or a 7 month ad hoc on those might be worth thinking about. And I know that we've got this combination of the employee personnel policies, the whole suite, and we don't need to go through every line of every one there, but there are some that are going to rise to the top in terms of our hiring practices and things like that become big ones. The affirmative action report, the compensation strategy, all that stuff. I think maybe a temporary ad hoc is to combine those kind of things would be something that I'd certainly be open to, and
That's good to know.
I think we should consider that. What else do I have in my notes? I'm trying to, as I said, trying to be organized. For the instruction work group, I think that with the pathways implementation, I think it's really important that we define the terms of the September 2018 vote, and that becomes part of it, that those terms are defined early so that it doesn't sneak up onto people.
Yeah.
I think in a similar way that with the middle school model, I think that there's got to be a kind of, go, no go, or go in this direction, don't go in that direction piece to that. In relation to the at-risk and more generally, two things that I had on my list that, like Dean with, actually I had MSCR on my list too, but Dean took it already. Two things I had on my list of things that I didn't see on here that have been kind of in the back of my head. One is attendance and truancy. And I don't know how we fit that in there, but I think that proactive strategies around attendance and truancy, if we look at, well, just the at-risk report we got recently, that approximately 1/3 of the students had been in 2 or more schools, and that was just in a single year. If we look at long-term mobility issues, and well, the second piece is mobility. So I think attendance and truancy are two things that I don't know where to fit them in. I would have initially fit them in with the enrollment reports, but we're not doing the enrollment reports. So perhaps in the instruction work group would be a place to hit those. The last thing is on the strategic framework. I like that the board will have a chance to shape the process early on. I would like to make sure that the board has an opportunity a month before finalization, 6 weeks before finalization, to say, we don't want this to be here, we want more of that, we want less of that. But right at the end, and I want to make sure that that's there, whether it's at a special meeting, whether it's at an instruction in a work group, someplace in there. That it's not, you got 2 weeks to look at this, yay or nay. That the penultimate step, the board is directly involved in a working manner. So I think that that's kind of, the other pieces. I like the upfront stuff that Dean described and kind of the version of what you described. I think that a regular update for the community and the board at the regular meetings is good. I think more intense work at the retreats is good.
Good.
But I think that last piece is just, to me, essential.
I agree with that, TJ, and that's what I'm imagining. So June at the end of the year retreat would be one round of feedback. Then we would take it, go back to work, rewrite it. August is the target date for having it finished, so it would have to come back to the board even another time that summer. So I think I completely get what you're saying and agree with that. And as far as attendance, truancy, and mobility, I want to think about that. That information I think will potentially be really important for the strategic framework rewrite. Not necessarily just as a kind of a topic in and of itself. I think it has great potential to inform our next steps as a district. So
the last thing is on the policy rewrites. I think that that having a small working group to do the vast majority of it is all is fine. But I think that we should also that there's going to be things in both the board policy and perhaps the employment policy that we're going to want to pull towards a wider discussion before the rewrites happen. I mean, and I don't know what they are yet. I haven't looked at those policies in a long time. But I think that I just think that so that to allow that flexibility to do that if Dylan and 2 other board members meet, we go through them and we say, what, these 4 policies need to be treated like we've done policy suites before. These other 15 don't, and that kind of thing. So I think that flexibility will be important.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah,
that's it.
I don't really have much. I do agree with TJ about just having more time with the strategic framework and perhaps different venue than the board retreats and then the during the regular board meeting, just because the regular board meetings are really packed and nobody's going to want to be discussing stuff at that meeting because we already have a lot to discuss. So that would be the only thing.
Okay, thank you.
Dean,
Okay, well, I had one other. Ever since you brought up the east side potential expansion, I've been thinking of that I think we need to be much more aggressively proactive in how we're approaching the potential absorption of that.
Okay.
And I don't think I don't know if there's a meeting, but I think that there's a strategy.
Long-range facilities
You've
plan
had some
related,
meetings, but it's
yeah.
got to be, I think I'm using the word aggressive purposely.
Yep, I hear ya.
In going after that.
Okay.
And I think that we start now.
And then I was thinking just quick, if we're going to work with the at-risk, can we put the truancy and that in there? I think
Could be there,
I
too.
think it
Yeah.
fits. I'm just going to use it personal because that's what I do. The number one reason I'm seeing my clients in juvenile court is truancy. It's the number one absolute reason they're there. And I think it contributes to our graduation issues, and I know it contributes to the school to prison pipeline. If we could find a way to stop that, in a way to keep them from ending up in the criminal system, whether it be restorative justice or something, it would
Okay.
be wonderful.
Yeah, I think it could really fit there too. Excellent.
Yeah. We've talked about this before, and I thought it would be under the strategic framework. But I really think it belongs under maybe operations, maybe instruction. I'm not sure. But I feel we should talk about how we drive change and have a process. Because I don't think what we're doing is good enough. And we look at this as if we're 50 schools, and then we take all this time for implementation of something that, frankly, we don't know what the impact is going to be. And I see our 50 schools as wonderful opportunities to be looking at and, frankly, testing different ideas about how we can effectively drive change, because a lot of what we do is we work on things from somewhat I want to say almost theoretical basis. It has practice behind it, right? In this school district they did this, or in this, or maybe it's something from our own schools. But how we actually drive innovation and change, and should we have a process that basically says this is how it needs to go through this step one in identifying what it is that we want to change, what this practice is going to be. Step two might be something how it's studied or other districts. Step three might be that it actually undergoes a pilot, and maybe it's 3 classrooms. But it goes this, and then it goes, and we basically, so that when we decide to put significant amounts of resources behind things and staff time and whatever, we already know. And frankly, it disciplines us as a board so that when we come on class sizes, we're not having this just back and forth. And frankly, I didn't feel we had compelling information that really informed this. And yet every single classroom we have out there is an opportunity to test our ideas.
Definitely.
And I believe it needs a real process, and I think it's an opportunity. And so I don't believe that actually it's part of the strategic framework. I think it's part of how we operate as a district, as a board, how we make, frankly, even decisions.
I will definitely give that some thought, Mary. We have already been talking about this. I will say that I have been imagining that that's part of the strategic framework discussion, because I think it's establishing a new way of working as a school district. And I know even in our own team's summer retreat, which I think will help inform the board's discussion in October for our start of school year retreat, early October. We spent quite a lot of time talking about ways of working, which is what what I think you're talking about, especially as it comes to innovation, and I mean that in the sense that you describe it, and how you lead through complexity, right? Not just solving complicated problems, but complex problems, and that has a lot to do with learning how to innovate, to fail quickly, to learn in faster, more rapid cycles of learning at the classroom level. And so completely in agreement with that. Like I said, I was imagining that would happen as part of our retreats, but I want to think about whether or not I want to test my thinking on that.
Yeah, I think I think it could very well fit there really well. I think the reason I was starting to shy away was this thing about where is the board really actively involved in the strategic plan, and I don't think this happens from a beginning of the year and sort of end of the year. I think it has to be, okay, this is what we sort of see, this is what we're thinking about. It comes to the board, we talk about it, we brainstorm around it. Okay, that sounds good, we come back. So I think it, and so maybe the retreats are a perfect time, and that it provides then your team with sort of benchmarks on, okay, this is when we can get this in front of the board, but with the idea of really implementing.
I love that. You know, and you're making me think of one last thing, James. This is not exactly related to that idea, but I did not mention, and I should have, that on the retreats, we did think it was also a good place to check in on the use of our actual equity policy. We just passed it this summer. Our goal, what we're thinking, is our goal would be to have the tool for you guys to begin to use, well, to look at that first retreat, then we start using it throughout the school year, have a check-in in mid-year to talk about how it's working, which would mean, I think, TJ, you had mentioned back when we had our last discussion before approving the equity policy, that we might need some time to try out the tool before actually approving it. So we like that idea and we're running with it. So we would create the tool, use it this year, and then set a goal to approve it either mid-year or end of year, depending on how we think it's working for us.
Great. We haven't gone to Kate yet, so Kate, if you have anything, we'll go to TJ, then come to you and check in with you.
Sounds good.
I just want to say that listening to Mary, one of the things that I thought of and was that what she describes is, in my head, ideally something that can happen through the school improvement processes, and that with the SIP things that and that and the SIP process becomes almost a rote, and not a useless exercise, but a rote exercise. And I think that whether through the strategic framework work or elsewhere, that looking at the SIP process and injecting opportunities for creativity, for small-scale experimental things, and a disciplined way of doing those. That I think that the SIP process is a place where, if we gave that level of freedom and local decision-making and local initiative to our schools, this is one place where it could live and thrive. That's what I thought of when I was listening to you.
Yeah, and I think that is a good possibility. The thing I believe we have to, if it ends there, I think it's 50 schools all doing 50 different things, and actually I don't believe, I think that's where it starts, but I believe we need a culture within our schools that is saying we are going to learn from others, and we're going to take the best of what's happening in any classroom in this and embrace it and feel it's ours. And I think, so I don't know how that happens, but I think it has, right? It has both of those.
Yeah, I love that.
Okay, Kate, do you have anything you'd like to add at this point?
Yeah, I agree with almost all of the comments that have been raised thus far. I'm very excited about shrinking the budget timeline. I think that will help us. And as an initial conversation, I think one of the things that for me was challenging this year is that our budget was different than previous years. We weren't cutting, we were actually adding. And so potentially, other than the budget items that you have laid out here, which I think are the big ones, having an opportunity to discuss kind of what would the new investments be, if you will, or, you know, kind of our marginal dollar, where do we put it, would be probably the right earliest conversation. I would, I guess, maybe just having listened to this, we've added a handful of things. I am a deep believer in doing few things well, and I think certainly the last few meetings we've kind of punted on a few things because we want to take longer and
the charter is not in here.
I guess my challenge is would be what would the things on this list be that we might take off or push to a subcommittee, or kind of that two-person model I think that you were mentioning, just in the spirit of adding some of the items that we've just talked through. I have a couple of ideas, but having not been through a whole year before, would probably defer to others on what the easiest, if you had to pick one bullet off of each column, what would be the easiest things to pull down into either a document that's shared or a two-person smaller group that engages more deeply. Just because I think we've just added 3 or 4 things.
Actually, don't think there's much. I feel like I would get out questions. It doesn't.
Yeah, I'm curious if there is anything that you or any other board member thinks does not belong on this list that is there. Because if we can take off, I would love to consider that with you.
Yeah, for me, I guess on the instruction work group, summer school was the one that jumped out to me. You know, I would rather discuss truancy than summer school. I'd rather discuss MSCR than summer school. I may be missing something there, so by all means. And then the partnership agreements was the one on operations that jumped out as something that we could get distributed documents on. You know, if there's not a major choice or change upcoming in then I think we could do it in a different format, because I do think we have, you know, choices or changes involved in lots of the items that people just added.
That is interesting, because we have, like in CBITS, which you just approved, that was a high-intensity partnership agreement. It went straight to the regular board meeting into the other business section because there just weren't many issues associated with it. So I think maybe we can determine as we get there ways to streamline the process. I think that's a really good point.
Kate, you still have the floor?
No, I guess I just open it back up if anyone else has anything. You know, we just, I think, talked about MSCR, truancy, East Side expansion, innovation. You know, is there anything that you wouldn't want to talk about as much as those things on the list?
Okay. All right, then we'll go to TJ.
All right, on the partnership agreements, funding and otherwise, my understanding is, and there's an evaluation due on Forward Madison, so I think that one's important. I don't know what the status of changes with people, but I know internally from the UW perspective that there's some changes going on there. So those are 2 where, and I don't know what either one of those is going to look like, but those could easily rise to the place where we definitely should give them attention.
Yeah, probably.
On the instruction work group, I'm not sure what the alternatives status is and where that's going to be and what that's going to be about. I don't know enough to know if it can be pulled, but offhand, from what I do know, that would be one that I would suggest pulling.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. You know, back to the how we drive change question. You know, what I always think about is, you know, once we establish this format and all these items, we tend to really get focused on talking about those.
Yeah.
And we spend the whole year talking about those. And I always wonder, is there something that we left out? You know, what did we leave out? You know, is there some important issue that we left out that could really be most important to driving that change that Mary's talking about? And I don't know how we redirect ourselves to that type of conversation or where it fits or anything. I do know that when you're doing a certain analysis, such as statistical analysis, one of the most important questions you ask is, you know, what's not in the analysis. and we typically don't talk about what's not here. And so, for example, Nikki mentioned earlier about the conversation with Dr. Osher, and he led off with the race issue.
Yeah.
And just, you know, and I don't know where you have the conversation, how you have it. Maybe you're having it in some of your professional development.
We do.
And so, but that's always a question for me. You know, we talk about how we want to drive change. We like to accelerate change, you know, speed up change as much as possible. Is there something not on the list? Is there something we're not thinking about? And, you know, how do we have that conversation? Is there a place, a bucket, where as we go through the year, we circle back and ask the question, you know, we're working on all these things, but are we really missing something? Are we leaving something off the table that could be really instrumental in change acceleration? Before we go to you, Dean, I think Anna had a hand up.
Yeah, one comment I just have in regard to the policy committee.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good idea. I feel like we spend a lot of time in our board meetings doing policy and trying to do all this wordsmithing as a group, and it's really wastes a lot of our time. So I think I fully support a policy committee.
Excellent.
And hope that Dylan gets extra pay
She deserves
for
it.
her time.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, to your conversation, Mary and TJ's conversation, and James just weighed in also. I just, it triggered some thoughts in my mind, is that two things here. Osher had mentioned, and I think some of us have talked about it independently with each other, but not at a meeting, of the impact of the social and political environment that we're living in right now.
That's right.
On what's happening with many of our students,
our youth,
our you know, our Latino students or students that are immigrants. The incredible explosion over the weekend in Virginia. And these things, and then over the last several years, shootings, those things do impact us. And I think that that's something that we have to consider in how we go about making change.
I agree.
And then, as Mary was talking about, we have we have these 50 schools, and inside of them we have hundreds, thousands of classrooms and teachers trying to do something a little bit different. And I know that there are teachers that have put proposals together about trying to do something different in their school, and I'm not certain how they're supported in that. Maybe through the SIP process, as TJ mentioned, is the way to go, and we can encourage that type of flexibility, using their creativity. And we got experienced teachers, a couple of them sitting right behind me, that I know put proposals together that want to do things differently in their classrooms, and why the hell not? You know, why can't we allow that to happen? And under the lines of what we just talked about, how can we drive change, and why can't we use our schools and our classrooms and our really experienced, really high quality teachers to help us do that? They can help us answer a lot of these questions.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're talking about.
Actually,
go ahead,
I'm not
Dean.
sure where that fits in here at all.
I think I was going to
Maybe
say,
instruction,
I just think it fits in with the strategic framework planning process. I think that is the discussion we all so desperately want to have. How do we drive change? How do we drive change all the way down to the classroom level? I think that is where it happens. And at the center of that discussion, James, has to be the issue of racism, how our students are experiencing the world around them. I think that is going to be a major focus of ours. It has to be this upcoming year. Heavily driven through the board retreats, but I hear what you guys are saying about the kind of topic list and instruction operation. How do you make it not just become a list of topics, right? To your point, James, I think that's really powerful. And I actually wonder if the equity policy will really help us in that respect. If we're driving all of these discussions through the equity policy that you just approved, it brings a very different lens to our decision making. Well, not necessarily different, a sharper lens.
If I may answer your question, James, I think also one place where we can discuss the issue of race, and we need to, is in our hiring and in our HR.
Absolutely.
I think that's the number one thing I'm hearing from my juvenile clients is none of the teachers look like me. None of them understand. They don't seem like me. They've never experienced some of the things I've experienced. That plays a role.
Yeah. That's excellent. Okay. Thank you. I very much appreciate the input. Just as a reminder for next steps, we take everything we heard, we try to scope it out into a year-long board calendar that then goes to both the board officers for review as well as the work group chairs. We finalize and then we give it out to the board, and final, as you know, is always a somewhat fluid thing, but at least we'll have our plan for the year.
Okay, so TJ wants a final
Real
comment?
quick. Well, it's not, just on the things that have traditionally been on agendas, that
Yeah.
are not on agendas.
Yeah.
I think that just, you said that this is a flexible process and
Yeah.
that there's room there. I think that if board members get the LL plan update, read it, and go, you know what, we need to talk
Really?
about this. We need to be open to doing that, and we need to, and it has to be not a big deal to make that happen. Because, and maybe all these things will be like, yeah, that's about what I expect, but there might be something that jumps out, and if it does, I don't want somebody to go, well, back in August, you said you didn't want to talk about that.
Well, we won't hold that to you, but we would encourage, as always, if one board member has questions, come talk to us. If the entire board or a majority of the board wants to have that discussion, by all means, that's your decision to make.
Okay, seeing any more questions, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Without a second.
Seconded.
Second. All
I
in
just,
favor?
aye.
All right.
I realized it after I said it. Wait a minute.
We did that already.
Oh, and I don't know.
Dean, can I get a ride today?